Tamar, in your experience, rooting out inaccuracies and bias against Israel in the media, is there anything new about today's phenomenon of fake news as it relates to Israel and the Middle East conflict? And how has social media impacted how fake news and media bias spreads?
Thank you for that question, Abra. And it's an honor to be here with my co-panelists, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today. CAMRA, or Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, was founded in 1982 during the First Lebanon War, and I've been with the organization since 1999. That's before the beginning of social media. So I can say with 100% certainty that there's nothing new about fake news. And I'd like to give you some examples. Going back to 1994, there was an aspiring student journalist at Arizona State University who wrote a first-person account that she published in her campus newspaper describing how she herself saw Orthodox Jews stoning to death a paraplegic Jew for using his electric wheelchair on the Sabbath at the Western Wall. And she wrote it with great intensity and detail about the smell of the blood and seeing the poor man fall from his wheelchair dying. And the entire piece was 100% fabrication. But it's not just the amateurs who were peddling in fake news back in the 90s. It was also the New York Times. There was a piece in 1994 which reported that Palestinian men in the Gaza Strip were arrested for carrying slices of watermelon because the fruit bears the same colors as the Palestinian flag: green, white, and red. I kid you not. I have it right here. The Times was forced to retract this preposterous story. 1 decade earlier, in 1983, the New York Times, again the paper of record, published a series of stories about hundreds of Palestinian girls in Tulkarm and in Jenin who fell ill with symptoms of dizziness, nausea, troubles with their vision. And it was a whole series of articles in the Times. The first of the articles said that the girls were poisoned, stated that as fact. And indeed, the Palestinian accusation was that Israel had used poison gas on these children. Well, the Israeli Ministry of Health launched an investigation, followed by a separate investigation by the American Center for CDC, for Disease Control. And both found that no organic substance caused these symptoms and that they were the result of mass hysteria. Again, the New York Times was forced to publish a lengthy editor's note, both fixing many factual problems and also acknowledging that there had been serious lapses in fairness, perspective, and balance. So, social media is not a necessary condition for fake news, but it certainly is a rich environment allowing fake news to thrive, and it's also an amplifier. Social media has drastically, profoundly changed the landscape of news coverage. To the extent that it's hard sometimes to draw a line between traditional news coverage and social media coverage, social news. For instance, the New York Times, when I started, was basically just a print newspaper with a website that wasn't very influential back in 1999. It was less read than the print publication. Well, the opposite is true now. In addition to the website, the New York Times has many blogs and multimedia features, and it has a presence in Facebook and Twitter. And many of the Times journalists also have their own Twitter and Facebook feeds that they use for professional purposes. So it creates a lot more noise and also a lot more space for things to go wrong. And they do go wrong. Mainstream traditional journalists are increasingly relying on Twitter, and this can be detrimental when they use Twitter in place of actual reporting and fact-checking. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In 2012, the conflict between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, November, a social media activist from the Gaza Strip tweeted a photograph of a gravely wounded girl, and he wrote with it, "Pain in Gaza." John Donison, who was a reporter with the BBC, retweeted that image to his nearly 8,000 followers, and he added "heartbreaking." And it was retweeted 95 times, so it reached an untold number of who knows how many people. But the girl in the photograph was not Gazan, she was not Palestinian, she was not located in the Gaza Strip. She was a Syrian child who had been injured a month earlier in that brutal conflict. Another example, May 2014, Haaretz, which is influential, at least in the English language, Israeli daily, published a completely bogus headline, both online and in print, which stated, Lag BaOmer in Hebron, settlers torch Palestinian orchard. Lag BaOmer is a Jewish holiday which is often celebrated with bonfires. Now, if you read the actual article that went along with this headline, you would see that there is zero truth to the headline. The community had lit a bonfire in a clearing next to an orchard, and no trees were burned. The only thing that was burned was Palestinian and other flags. But that did not stop Peter Beinart, an American journalist, from retweeting that false headline. He didn't even take the trouble of reading the story that he was tweeting, a journalist. And he exacerbated the falsehood by adding to it Lag BaOmer pogrom. In other words, massacre or mass persecution based on ethnicity. And he has 23,000 followers. Well, Haaretz was compelled to correct its headlines and Beinart to apologize. There was an interesting article a few days ago in the New York Times by Farhad Manjoor in which he talked about how Twitter is making news dumber. It exacerbates groupthink, and coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has in any event already been plagued by herd mentality for at least a couple of decades. So this is troubling to understand the impact now of Twitter on top of it. He also points out that Twitter allows for anonymity, and therefore it's awash with bots, which are fake people who are manipulated, who are used by real people to push misinformation, propaganda, or a political agenda. And one Oxford University professor referred to this as manufacturing consensus, which means to create the illusion of popularity around a particular candidate or political idea. And we saw this play out on the ground exactly with the coverage of the Iran deal. I don't know how many people here saw or read the interview with Ben Rhodes, who was President Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor. He had a very revealing interview in the New York Times Magazine in March 2016, in which he acknowledged that he created an echo chamber to drum up sympathetic media coverage and create an internet buzz in favor of the Iran nuclear deal. So this is all occurring against the backdrop of news organizations cutting back on their budget for foreign media coverage. That means less staff, less diversity, more reliance on wire services, and at the same time, Foreign Desk is not likely, there's a huge temptation to not send a journalist out in the field on the ground to ferret out little-known facts or find a really interesting story that's not being covered elsewhere. Instead, there's the temptation to look at Twitter and what is the trending topic at Twitter. This is a determining factor of what will drive the news agenda. I had a couple points about positive aspects of social media. If
we might not have time for that right now, but we can revisit it after.
So on the upside, and I think that Mark Zell alluded to this, when the mainstream media is not functioning properly, social media presents an opportunity to bypass the mainstream media. And for instance, if the mainstream media narrative is that Israeli commandos are attacking Turkish peace activists who are doing nothing but bringing badly needed humanitarian aid to break an illegal siege on the Gaza Strip, and the Israeli army has information showing otherwise. It did provide that information to the public through social media. We can also use social media platforms to appeal to a journalist's sense of fair play. They become much more accessible to us given their Twitter presence, and or name and shame them. And we can use this tool, leverage it to prompt better media coverage. We do it all the time. We did it with Ben Rhodes, who was the echo chamber Obama official. He appeared in the NewsHour in December claiming, and this is fake news, that Israel is constructing tens of thousands of new settlements. Israel has not built any new communities across the Green Line in some 2 decades, and has a total of just over 200 what are called settlements and illegal outposts combined. So he was way, way off, and this we were able to publicize on social media. It went viral, and it compelled the ombudsman of PBS to call on NewsHour to correct the falsehood. And just this week, one last point, just this week again, we were able to use Twitter to call on Huffington Post Arabic to correct a lot of misinformation about Israel. They did correct, including the false claim that many Israelis, all pro-settlement Israelis, aspire to a greater Israel from the Nile to the Euphrates. So Twitter, this was retracted in this Arabic publication, Huffington Post. This is a product of Cameron's new Arabic department. So it can be a vehicle for promoting more accurate coverage as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much.